Hello, listening squirrels. We are on chapter 30. And I'm almost done with this blame thing. Really, it could be done, but I'm trying to get to where it says I should be in the pattern. But I might fudge it because I like it snug. I like to squeeze my head. Okay, I said chapter 30, I think, of, you know it, it's in the title, The Murder at the Vicarage. We stared at her. I really think that for a moment or two we really believed she was out of her mind. The accusation seemed so utterly preposterous. Colonel Melchett was the first to speak. He spoke kindly and with a kind of pitying tolerance. "That's absurd, Miss Marple," he said. "Young Redding has been completely cleared." "Naturally," said Miss Marple. "He saw to that." "On the contrary," said Colonel Melchett dryly, "he did his best to get himself accused of the murder." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "he took us all in that way, myself as much as anyone else. You will remember, dear Mr. Clement, that I was quite taken aback when I heard Mr. Redding had confessed to the crime. It upset all my ideas and made me think him innocent when up to then I had felt convinced that he was guilty." "Then it was Lawrence Redding you suspected?" "I know that in books it's always the most unlikely person, but I never find that rule applies in real life. There it is so often the obvious that is true. Much as I have always liked Mrs. Prothero, I could not avoid coming to the conclusion that she was completely under Mr. Redding's thumb and would do anything he told her. And, of course, he's not the kind of young man who would dream of running away with a penniless woman. From his point of view, it was necessary that Colonel Prothero should be removed, and so he removed him." I hope my light's blinking and bothering anybody. If it makes you want to go into a seizure or anything, so close your eyes if that bugs you. Next time I won't do that. I'll just leave them on. I hadn't thought about that. Penniless, removed, so he removed him. One of those charming young men who have no moral sense. Colonel Melchett had been snorting impatiently for some time. Now he broke out. "Absolute nonsense, the whole thing. Redding's time is fully accounted for up to 6:50. And Haydock says positively Prothero couldn't have been shot then. I suppose you think you know better than a doctor? Or do you suggest that Haydock is deliberately lying? The Lord knows why." "I think Dr. Haydock's evidence was absolutely truthful. He's a very upright man, and of course it was Mrs. Prothero who actually shot Colonel Prothero, not Mr. Redding." Again we stared at her. Miss Marple arranged her lace fichu, F-I-C-H-U, pushed back the fleecy shawl that draped her shoulders, and began to deliver a gentle, old-maidish lecture comprising the most astounding statements in the most natural way in the world. "I have not thought it right to speak until now. One's own belief, even so strong as to amount to knowledge, is not the same as proof, and unless one has an explanation that will fit all the facts, in parentheses, as I was saying to dear Mr. Clement this evening, one cannot advance it with any real conviction, and my own explanation was not quite complete. It lacked just one thing. But suddenly, just as I was leaving Mr. Clement's study, I noticed the palm in the pot by the window, and well, there the whole thing was, clear as daylight." "Mad, quite mad," murmured Melchett to me. But Miss Marple beamed on us serenely and went on in her gentle, ladylike voice. I was very sorry to believe what I did, very sorry, because I liked them both. But you know what human nature is, and to begin with, when first he and then she both confessed in the most foolish way, well, I was more relieved than I could say I had been wrong. And I began to think of other people who had a possible motive for wishing Colonel Prothero out of the way. "The 7 suspects," I murmured. She smiled at me. "Yes, indeed. There was that man Archer, not likely, but primed with drink so inflaming, you never know. And of course there was your Mary. She'd been walking out with Archer a long time, and she's a queer-tempered girl, motive and opportunity. Why, she was alone in the house. Old Mrs. Archer could easily have got the pistol from Mrs. Redding's house for either of those two, so I guess that's 3. And then, of course, there was Lettuce, wanting freedom and money to do as she liked. I've known many cases where the most beautiful and ethereal girls have shown next to no moral scruple, though, of course, gentlemen never wished to believe it of them. I winced. And then there was the tennis racket. Oh, who's got the tennis racket, though? Continued Miss Marple. The tennis racket? Yes, the one Mrs. Price Ridley's Clara saw lying on the grass by the vicarage gate. That looked as though Mr. Dennis had got back earlier from his tennis party than he said. Boys of 16 are so very susceptible and so very unbalanced. Whatever the motive, for Lettuce's sake or for yours, it was a possibility. So Dennis? And then, of course, there was poor Mr. Hawes and you. Not both of you naturally, but alternatively, as the lawyers say. Me? I exclaimed in lively astonishment. Well, yes, I do apologize, and indeed I never really thought, but there was the question of those disappearing sums of money. Either you or Mr. Hawes must be guilty, and Mrs. Price Ridley was going about everywhere, hinting that you were the person in fault, principally because you objected so vigorously to any kind of inquiry into the matter. That's some of the tea that I bought. I forgot about it. Bought in Salisbury which is our closest big town. Not really big, but when I met up with David at the Tea and Spice Exchange, it's really good. I think it's orange and ginger. It's expensive, though. Of course, I myself was Mr. Hawes. Of course, I myself was also convinced it was Mr. Hawes. He reminded me so much of that unfortunate organist I mentioned, but all the same, one couldn't be absolutely sure, human nature being what it is, I ended grimly. Exactly. And then, of course, there was dear Griselda. But Mrs. Clement was completely out of it, interrupted Melchett. She returned by the 6:50 train. That's what she said, retorted Miss Marple. One should never go by what people say. The 6:50 was half an hour late that night, but at 7:15 I saw her with my own eyes starting for Old Hall, so it followed that she must have come by the earlier train. Indeed, she was seen, but perhaps you know that. That was a question. Perhaps you know that? She looked at me inquiringly. Some magnetism in her glance impelled me to hold out the last anonymous letter, the one I had opened. So short a time ago, it set out in detail that Griselda had been seen leaving Lawrence Redding's cottage by the back window at 6:20 on the fatal day. I said nothing then or at any time of the dreadful suspicion that had for one moment assailed my mind. I had seen it in nightmare terms, a past intrigue between Lawrence and Griselda, the knowledge of it coming to Prothero's ears, his decision to make me acquainted with the facts, and Griselda, desperate, stealing the pistol and silencing Prothero. As I say, a nightmare only, but invested for a few long minutes with a dreadful appearance of reality. I don't know whether Miss Marple had any inkling of all this. Very probably she had. Few things are hidden from her. She handed me back the note with a little nod. "That's been all over the village," she said, "and it did look rather suspicious, didn't it? Especially with Mrs. Arthur swearing at the inquest that the pistol was still in the cottage when she left at midday." She paused a minute and then went on, "But I'm wandering terribly from the point. What I want to say, and believe it my duty, is to put my own explanation of the mystery before you. If you don't believe it, well, I shall have done my best. Even as it is, my wish to be quite sure before I spoke may have cost poor Mr. Hawes his life." Again she paused, and when she resumed, her voice held a different tone. It was less apologetic, more decided. "That is my own explanation of the facts. By Thursday afternoon the crime had been fully planned down to the smallest detail. Lawrence Redding first called on the vicar, knowing him to be out. He had with him the pistol which he concealed in that pot." I wondered what that had to do with anything. "In the stand by the window. When the vicar came in, Lawrence explained his visit by a statement that he had made up his mind to go away. At 5:30, Lawrence Redding telephoned from the North Lodge to the vicar, adopting a woman's voice. You remember what a good amateur actor he was. Mrs. Prothero, excuse me, Mrs. Prothero and her husband had just started for the village, and a very curious thing, quotations, though no one happened to think of it that way, Mrs. Prothero took no handbag with her. Really a most unusual thing for a woman to do. Just before 6:20, she passes my garden and stops and speaks so as to give me every opportunity of noticing that she has no weapon with her, and also that she is quite her normal self. They realized, you see, that I'm a noticing kind of person. She disappears around the corner of the house to the study window. The poor colonel is sitting at the desk writing his letter to you. He is deaf, as we all know. She takes the pistol from the bowl where it is waiting for her, comes up behind him and shoots him through the head, throws down the pistol and is out again like a flash, and going down the garden to the studio. Nearly anyone would swear that there couldn't have been time." "But the shot," objected the colonel. "You didn't hear the shot." "There is, I believe, an invention called a Maxim silencer. So I gather from detective stories. I wonder if possibly the sneeze that the maid Clara heard might have actually been the shot. But no matter. Mrs. Prothero is met at the studio by Mr. Redding. They go in together, and human nature being what it is, I'm afraid they realize that I shan't leave the garden till they come out again." I had never liked Miss Marple better than at this moment, with her humorous perception of her own weakness. When they do come out, their demeanor is gay and natural, and there, in reality, they made a mistake. Because if they had really said goodbye to each other as they pretended, they would have looked very different. But you see, that was their weak point. They simply dare not appear upset in any way. For the next 10 minutes, they are careful to provide themselves with what is called an alibi, I believe. Finally, Mr. Redding goes to the vicarage, leaving it as late as he dares. He probably saw you on the footpath from far away and was able to time matters nicely. He picks up the pistol and the silencer, leaves the forged letter with the time on it written in a different ink and apparently in a different handwriting. When the forgery is discovered, it will look like a clumsy attempt to incriminate Anne Prothero. But when he leaves the letter, he finds the one actually written by Colonel Prothero something quite unexpected, and being a very intelligent young man and seeing that this letter may come in very useful to him, he takes it away with him. He alters the hands of the clock to the same time as the letter, knowing that it's always kept a quarter of an hour fast. The same idea, attempt to throw suspicion on Mrs. Prothero. Then he leaves, meeting you outside the gate and acting the part of someone nearly distraught. As I say, he is really most intelligent. What would a murderer who had committed a crime try to do? Behave naturally, of course. So that is just what Mr. Redding does not do. He gets rid of the silencer but marches into the police station with the pistol and makes a perfectly ridiculous self-accusation which takes everybody in. There was something fascinating in Miss Marple's resume of the case. She spoke with such certainty that we both felt in this way, and in no other could the crime have been committed. What about the shot heard in the wood? I asked. Was that the coincidence to which you were referring earlier this evening? Oh dear, no. Miss Marple shook her head briskly. That wasn't a coincidence. Very far from it. It was absolutely necessary that a shot should be heard. Otherwise, suspicion of Mrs. Prothero might have continued. How Mr. Redding arranged it, I don't quite know, but I understand that picric acid explodes if you drop a weight on it. And you will remember, dear Vicar, that you met Mr. Redding carrying a large stone just in that part of the wood where you picked up that crystal later. Gentlemen are so clever at arranging things. The stone suspended above the crystals, and then a time fuse, or a slow match, something that would take about 20 minutes to burn through, so that the explosion would come about 6:30 when he and Mrs. Prothero had come out of the studio and were in full view. A very safe device, because what would there be to find afterwards? Only a big stone. But even that he tried to remove when you came upon him. I believe you're right, I exclaimed, remembering the start of surprise Lawrence had given on seeing me that day. It seemed natural enough at the time, but now... Miss Marple seemed to read my thoughts, for she nodded her head shrewdly. Yes, she said, it must have been a very nasty shock for him to come across you just then. But he turned it off very well, pretending he was bringing it to me for my rock garden. Only Miss Marple became suddenly very emphatic. It was the wrong sort of stone for my rock gardens, and that put me on the right track. All this time, Colonel Melchett had sat like a man in a trance. Now he showed signs of coming to. He snorted once or twice, blew his nose in a bewildered fashion, and said, "Upon my word, well, upon my word." Beyond that, he did not commit himself. I think that he, like myself, was impressed with the logical certainty of Miss Marple's conclusions, but for the moment he was not willing to admit it. Instead, he stretched out a hand, picked up the crumpled letter, and barked out, "All very well, but how do you account for this fellow Halls?" Why, he actually rang up and confessed. Yes, that was what was so providential. The vicar's sermon, doubtless. You know, dear Mr. Clement, you really preached a most remarkable sermon. It must have affected Mr. Halls deeply. He could bear it no longer and felt he must confess about the misappropriations of the church funds. Not a murder. What? Yes, and that under Providence is what has saved his life, for I hope and trust it is saved. Dr. Haydock is so clever. As I see the matter, Mr. Redding kept this letter, a risky thing to do, but I expect he hid it in some safe place and waited till he found out for certain to whom it referred. He soon made quite sure that it was Mr. Hall's. I understand he came back here with Mr. Hall's last night and spent a long time with him. I suspect that he then substituted a cachet of his own for one of Mr. Hall's and slipped this letter in the pocket of Mr. Hall's dressing gown. The poor young man would swallow the fatal cachet in all innocence. After his death, his things would be gone through and the letter found, and everyone would jump to the conclusion that he had shot Colonel Prothero and taken his own life out of remorse. I rather fancy Mr. Hall's must have found that letter tonight just after taking the fatal, I guess it was cachet, C-A-C-H-E-T. In his disordered state, it must have seemed like something supernatural, and coming on top of the vicar's sermon, it must have impelled him to confess the whole thing. "Upon my word," said Colonel Melchett, "upon my word, most extraordinary. I don't believe a word of it." He had never made a statement that sounded more unconvincing. It must have sounded so in his own ears, for he went on. "And can you explain the other telephone call, the one from Mr. Redding's cottage to Mrs. Price Ridley?" "Ah," said Miss Marple, "that is what I call the coincidence. Dear Griselda sent that call. She and Mr. Dennis between them, I fancy, they had heard the rumors Mrs. Price Ridley was circulating about the vicar, and they thought of this, perhaps rather childish, way of silencing her. The coincidence lies in the fact that the call should have been put through at exactly the same time as the fake shot from the wood. It led one to believe that the two must be connected. I suddenly remembered how everyone who spoke of that shot had described it as different from the usual shot. They had been right. Yet how hard to explain just in what way the difference of the shot consisted. Colonel Melchett cleared his throat. "Your solution is a very plausible one, Miss Marple," he said, "but you will allow me to point out that there is not a shadow of proof." "I know," said Miss Marple, "but you believe it to be true, don't you?" There was a pause, and the Colonel said almost reluctantly, "Yes, I do, dash it all. It's the only way the thing could have happened, but there's no proof. Not an atom." Miss Marple coughed. "That is why I thought perhaps, under the circumstances, yes, a little trap might be permissible." That's the end, and I'm going to stop there. Because that was almost 24 minutes. So we'll be at 31 next time. Let's see how many chapters this thing has. I'm thinking 33. Nope. Just two more. 31, and it's real short. And 32 is very short too. So I'll read both of those tomorrow. And then the next one in the Miss Marple mystery, thank goodness, I guess she just comes at the end. It's called, did I just say it? The Body in the Library. And that only has 18 chapters. don't know, though. No, it only gives me a few chapters that, remember, I just got a sample. Because they want $70 for the set of Miss Marple books. Golly, Pete. So anyway. Table of contents. Sorry, just looking around. Love y'all. Have a good night. See you tomorrow at 5. Love you. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Bye-bye.